Good evening. Chicago Musical College of Roosevelt University brings you A Visit with Rudolph Ganz. Mr. Ganz, President Emeritus of Chicago Musical College, is internationally known as a composer, conductor, and concert pianist. As a composer, he's best remembered for his Symphony in E, for his piano concerti, for his piano compositions for children, and for more than 200 songs. As a conductor, he has directed the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra, the New York Philharmonic, and the San Francisco Symphony, and has appeared as guest conductor in London, Paris, Chicago, New York, and across the nation. As a concert pianist, Mr. Ganz made his American debut in 1903 in Chicago's famed Auditorium Theater. Tonight he will tell us about the golden age of opera in Chicago.
Good evening to everyone. The title of tonight's visit with RG is The Golden Era of Chicago. However, I can improve a bit upon this title because there are three golden eras of Chicago that I shall talk about. And the first one began in 1889 and ended in 1910. It represented the visits of the New York Metropolitan Opera Company here in our city at the Auditorium Theater. The second era flourished from 1910 to 1947, partly in the Auditorium and finally in the new Civic Opera House. The third one had its unusually successful beginning in 1954, and I have a great surprise for you, a guest whom I'm anxious to honor and pay my respect to before my TV audience. The first golden era is also the story of the Auditorium Theater down on Congress Street. This famous hall is known all over the world, and it is now awaiting its rediscovery and its reawakening. Its history during the last 50, 60 years is one of great interest. It has been a civic asset, and Chicago should realize that its activities should be renewed. The Auditorium Theater must have a rebirth. The Auditorium Theater is worth of the attention of the citizens of Chicago. I have some photographs here to accompany my talk about how the building of the hall was planned, how it was completed and dedicated. Here is the well-known lobby. Society dined at the Congress Hotel and then marched in elegant procession through the tunnel, the subterranean tunnel under Congress Street. It's now closed because the Army took over the place. This is the auditorium itself. You see the parquet here and the boxes back of them, and the first rows of the parquet disappeared when the Army took over, and they established some excellent bowling alleys. An entirely different sound from Rigoletto and Lohengrin. And here is part of that higher part of the auditorium with the beautiful paintings, and I see the name of Bach, Beethoven, Berlioz, and Haydn. And naturally, Bach didn't write any operas, but he wrote beautiful music for the orchestra, and Theodore Thomas let people know what he wrote. Here is the stage, the old stage. Just before a rehearsal, you can see the orchestra pit, and here is the big banquet hall of the old auditorium hotel. That's where all the great festivities were given. It is now the study hall for the students of Roosevelt University. Here is the building as it was after its erection. The photograph is from a book which was made in 1890. The photographs are excellent still. Here is the celebrated tower. In a library up there, this book was found only recently. Here is what happens under the stage, the hydraulic lift, which lifts the sceneries, and sometimes the devil in Faust. Here is the right side of the auditorium theater seen from the stage, and here is the left side. Mary Garden, the divine Mary Garden, sat in this box during her reign, which was a marvelously successful reign, except for the little deficit of 1,100,000. So here are some pictures of the auditorium. Someday you will go there and help celebrating the reawakening. I want to say a word about how did it appear on the horizon of our city. Ferdinand Peck, a wide-awake citizen, had dreamt of a great hall, and I quote, "Within this hall the multitude might gather for all sorts of purposes, including grand opera." He contacted, this was in 1885, he contacted the two well-known architects, Louis Sullivan and Dankmar Adler. Adler was also an acoustical expert, and we all are very thankful that he succeeded in doing what he wanted. They were enthusiastic about the idea. The official dedication took place on December 9th, 1889. President Harrison spoke, the mayor of the city spoke, the governor of Illinois spoke, and Adelina Patti sang two songs. The first one was Home Sweet Home, perfectly natural for her to sing that evening, and a Swiss echo song. I was in Switzerland at the time and could not hear the echo myself. Next evening was the official dedication, and Romeo and Juliet of Gounod was performed. Adelina Patti sang Marguerite, and it must have been a very wonderful performance. Strange as it may seem, the same opera, Romeo and Juliet, was given again on January 26, 1929, which was the last opera performance in the auditorium, because then opera moved somewhere else. Edith Mason was the Marguerite, and Charlie Hackett was the Romeo, and the conductor was Maestro Polacco. The Metropolitan visits began in 1890. All I know about the early years is what information I found in my good friend, the late Edward Moore's book, 40 Years of Opera in Chicago. I want to mention a few names of the wonderful singers who appeared during those seasons. Lili Lehmann, the great German dramatic soprano, Emil Fischer, the Hans Sachs of that time, Francesco Tamagno, the great tenor, Madame Albani, Emma Eames and Lillian Nordica, the great American singers, and the two brothers Deresque. Jean, the tenor, and Edouard the bass. There was Emma Calvé, the Carmen, although I would like to tell a little story. She was a great singer, not awfully well acquainted with the time and the beat. And there was an incident when she started on the wrong beat after her comeback, and Alfred Herz interrupted, and he said to her, "Madam, you have an awfully good memory. You come in at the wrong time just as you used to 10 years ago." There was a new Carmen discovered just lately in Vienna, a little American girl who sang her Carmen in Vienna a few weeks ago, and a new star was born, the paper said. After the opera was over, Jean Browning of St. Louis had 45 recalls, and I wouldn't be surprised if before long we don't hear her in our own third golden era. Nellie Melba, Campanari, the toreador of the time, our own Hermann de Vries, the American David Bispham, Ernestine Schumann-Heink, Mühlmann, and many others. All these illustrious names may not mean very much to the young generation, but teenagers also are bound to have parents and grandparents who can tell them of the glorious evenings at the hall. Edward Moore, who was then music critic of the Chicago Tribune at that time, wrote in later years, quote, "Those were the cast that even in days long afterwards cause envious licking of the lips." How about the admission prices? Usually $2 up. However, the New Orleans French Opera Company had top prices of $150, and Colonel Savage's opera in English, top price $150, but during Christmas weeks that year he came to the Studebaker with a second opera company, and prices were from a quarter to $1. How things change during the years. I may be permitted to talk of other events during those years at the auditorium. October 16th, 1891, our great Theodore Thomas made his debut with the Chicago Symphony. On January 1st and 2nd, Jan Paderewski appeared for the first time in Chicago. In 1892 and 93, the Columbian Exposition had its headquarters at the auditorium, and I'm told it took 6 months to clean it up. So the events have been marching along, and Mrs. Ganz and I arrived in this city in September 1900, and from there on witnessed Grand Opera ourselves for 5 years. I may disclose modestly that I was asked to be critic for 2 evenings for the Chicago Americans, and I behaved just as badly as the professional critics. Society dined, as I said, in the beautiful dining room with a pool of water into which one of the social ladies fell of sheer enthusiasm. Moore called the cast phenomenal. There was one performance of the Magic Flute with a cast really so remarkable, I have to say. Who were they? Sembrich, the outstanding. The cast forced Maurice Grau to lift the price from $350 to $5,000, and they took in $15,000 that night. At another performance of the Magic Flute, something unusual happened. Campanari and Fritz Scheff were so successful in the duet, the Papageno duet, that the audience would not release them. Finally, Madame Sembrich walked up on the stage, but the audience persisted to applaud, so Madame Sembrich simply walked out of the stage and the house. And they had to announce that the last ensemble cannot be performed because Madame Sembrich has disappeared. This is just a little indication that opera singers may be temperamental. They gave the complete ring, and Mascagni came to conduct his Cavalleria Rusticana, and he also had a concert which was not very successful. There were performances of Parsifal, which lasted from 5 to 7 and 9 to 12. They tried it in the daytime from 11:30 to 5:20, but they made up for it in the evening by giving the Fledermaus. New names appear: Olive Fremstadt, Caruso, Anton Van Roy, Geraldine Farrar, Didur, Amy Destine, Alfred Herz, the conductor, and last but not least, Arturo Toscanini. This is the end of the first golden era. If I may permit it, since this is a visit with Rudolph Ganz, to say a word about my activities in that wonderful hall, the Auditorium Theatre. I made my debut on March 20th under Theodore Thomas in 1903 with the Chicago Symphony. And I well remember our dear Frederick Stock was still playing the viola on the first stand. In 1904, Theodore Thomas moved to Orchestra Hall. In 1907, the Boston Symphony came for the first time to Chicago under Dr. Mook, and I happened to be the soloist that night. It was a great house playing the Tchaikovsky concerto. In 1932, after the theater had been closed for a few years, we, the Bohemians of Chicago, of which organization I happened to be the president, we reopened the auditorium as gloriously as one can imagine. Joseph Hoffman, Elsa Alsen, and John Charles Thomas had given their services for this occasion. And we made over $6,000 to be given to needy musicians in that emergency. In 1933, you all remember, those who were there, naturally, the 100th anniversary of the incorporation of our city. Dr. Stock had a number of concerts. I played with him at the first one and conducted the second one, and this should show you how closely I feel related to that hall. The second era, as I said, from 1910 to 1922, under the sponsorship of the Harold McCormicks. Those who can afford to pay for a whole season are not numerous anymore. And it is up to the cities and the music lovers in a big city to support those great cultural assets. During that first season, there were 63 performances and 8 Sunday concerts. A remarkable board of directors was composed of most of the leading citizens of Chicago. Campanini was the general music director. And among the new names, we find Mary Garden, who appeared as Melisande, Louise, Salome, and what happened? The chief of police was going to forbid the second performance. He was afraid for his morals. There was a second performance, however, and the third one was omitted. We know better now. We are very quiet when we look at Salome dancing, whatever she does. Rosa Raisa, Aida, Norma, Desdemona, the girl of the Golden West, and also the Bat. There is Gallicurci, who made a sensational debut on November 18th, 1916. There was John McCormack, Tetrazzini, and Scotti, all names that some of you surely must remember. There was Tito Ruffo, George Hamlin, Forrest Lamont, Edward Johnson, Anna Fitzhugh, Banchi, Claire Dukes, and our dear and marvelously gifted Edith Mason. In 1922, Samuel Insull took over as sponsor. And under his regime came the dedication of the Civic Opera House, which he had really built. And the opera was Aida, and Aida was Rosa Raisa, the great dramatic soprano who is now the citizen of our city. Claudio Muzio, Schipa, Marian Clare, and Shaliapin, who played Boris Godunov. In 1925, they gave the Rosenkavalier with Mason, Reiser, and Kipnis. This way, the seasons go on, and I must now speak of the third golden era. It had its beginning, as you heard, in February '54, and followed by an immensely successful season in the fall of '54, and a second in the fall of '55. I quote our own Claudia Cassidy in last Sunday's Tribune. Our orchestra and our lyric theater have put their quality on their highest level. It is up to us to match them on our side of the footlights. And here is the promised surprise of tonight's visit. The young woman who is the guiding spirit, the enthusiastic maker, and the successful manager of the lyric theater, Miss Carol Fox. May I come over to you, Miss Fox?
Ganz.
I'm very happy to have you with us tonight, and I'm very proud to be able to congratulate you and pay my respects to you right here.
Thank you so very much.
I want to mention also in the congratulations your splendid co-worker and managing director, Mr. Lawrence Kelly. You say he is flying to New York
Flying
tonight?
home from New York.
Oh, home from New York.
We begin work tomorrow again.
Oh, well, you tell him that we mentioned him and are sorry that he could not be with us. I have here a sentence which I would like to tell. Miss Fox, you have brought opera back to Chicago. Youth has conquered again where fear and routine failed and old age failed to function. Now it is my pleasure to ask you a few questions, and I know you will graciously answer them. The first one is, tell us something about your studies in America and abroad.
Oh, that's a very broad question, Dr. Ganz. Well, my studies began in Chicago. I'm a native of Chicago and went to school here. And then later I decided that I would like to be a grand opera singer. So I began my studies with innumerable of the illustrious singing teachers here in Chicago, Vittorio Trevisan, Victor DeYoung, Richard Theodore Harrison, and Edith Mason. I believe I was Edith Mason's first pupil, even before she started teaching her own daughter, Graciela.
I remember that.
And then I later went to New York and decided that I would work there for a few years, trying my wings. And I began studying with Virgilio Lazzari, another great artist of Chicago Opera
I
Company.
should have mentioned him, really.
A wonderful, wonderful artist. And then later with Giovanni Martinelli, another Chicago opera favorite, in Ravinia Park. And I later went to Europe with Mr. Martinelli, where I lived with his family both in Rome and in their villa north at Cortina d'Ampezzo and around the Como region too.
That's wonderful.
And from there, I felt that I was ready to try my first wings and sang a limited number of performances in the small villages and hamlets of Italy.
I mean, that's no doubt you acquired experience right there.
Well, I learned a little bit of what I shouldn't do. I never got much further than that, actually.
No, really. Now, the second question. How long did you nurse the idea of operatic renaissance for our city?
Well, I believe it was while I was studying in Italy that I began to think of, well, not lyric theater, but of an idea for a resident opera company in Chicago. I realized that one day I would come home to Chicago, and that what I loved most of all and hoped to do was to be a grand opera singer, but there was very little of in Chicago, because during those days, in 1950, there had been sporadic attempts in 45, 46, but there wasn't a resident company that belonged to Chicago. And though I did not quite think of it in terms of lyric theater today, I wanted to try to start a motion toward something perhaps civically based and brought up and worked on by young people, we who had perhaps more time and more devotion toward the cause.
Excellent. How long did it take you to plan for the second performance, the two performances in February, 5th and 7th?
Well, the artistic planning took possibly 5 or 6 months, but the incorporation of lyric theater and the weeks and months and years of planning toward building the organization, well, that actually was 2 years. We incorporated in March of 1952. our Illinois not-for-profit organization. And those months, year and a half's time, was spent in finding loyal workers to help fundraise, interest raise, and then sell the tickets for what was at one time a scheduled 1 Don Giovanni. And when that sold out 100%, we scheduled a second and sold that out also.
That was wonderful. I remember well. You see, we in the profession should be doubly grateful to you for doing your share so beautifully. You wanted to be independent of New York and San Francisco, did you not?
Well, independent, I presume, in a sense, because we wanted our own company. We felt that Chicago should have its own resident company, as it had for so many, many years. We did look and lean a little toward San Francisco Opera, as we felt that we could pattern ourselves somewhat after their 5, 6, 7-week season. We could not aspire to the Metropolitan's 24 weeks with its 70 years of heritage.
Indeed. Will you tell us something about the fact that the selling of tickets does not pay for an opera season? And you might say a little word about the different deficits, the necessary deficits.
Well, that is another large question. That's a large deficit. Selling of tickets, of course, is a very necessary thing. We always look toward 100% sellout. We've been very fortunate this year in an 89.5% of the entire season. But even if we did achieve the 100%, it would not cover the costs of the refurbishing of the sceneries, the rehearsal periods. Our chorus began on May 31st this year to rehearse, and our orchestra well over a month before the season began. And, of course, the artists and the many other things that comprise grand opera.
Yes, surely.
And therefore, though the ticket price, we feel we've kept our tickets at a nominal price for the type and caliber of opera we give.
Well, really, the important question may be, now that Mayor Daley has mentioned the possibility of financial support from the city, wouldn't you like to have a guarantee for 3 seasons to come?
It would be the greatest New Year's present in the world.
It is with great pleasure that I greet your answers, which should be very informative for everyone who is listening in. And I think it is time for me to say good night to you, and many thanks for coming to us this evening. It's been my special personal pleasure to have you. And we should all of us pledge to support you to the best of our force.
Thank you most sincerely, Dr. Ganz.
May I shake your hand and wish you the best of luck for the next 3 seasons.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been A Visit with Rudolph Ganz, brought to you by Chicago Musical College of Roosevelt University. Tonight's guest has been Miss Carol Fox, founder and general manager of the Lyric Theater. Next week's program has been given a most intriguing title by Dr. Ganz. He calls it Welcome Dissonance.